Thanks for coming. Mark Canella, University of Vermont Extension. I'm here in the office in Berlin, Vermont. Introduction to Maple Business and Transfer Planning. Let's get into it. If you signed up for the for this session, you've probably been to Maple Manager, at least for the sign up. Just always encouraging people to go back. We've added a few more business planning resources in the past couple months. We did have a technical report that hit, which is a survey of Northeastern maple producers, dates back to 2019, but pretty rich data about some of the trends in the Northeast, which was exciting to put together. And then the other more recent documents, there are some startup investment profiles. If you or anyone you know is looking at getting established or doing a complete overhaul, we put together numbers on startup tubing systems, basic equipment, basic sugar house, really to put some numbers to how big the investment is as people get going. Here we are on the 31st. Coming up, we've got 4 more sessions. Next week's the 7th. Mark Iselhart's going to do a presentation on maple syrup quality. This goes back to about a little over a year ago. We did an intensive project. We bought over 200 samples of syrup online and tested for them for quality standards. And had some interesting findings from what we saw, what we graded, what we tasted. Mark's going to talk about that next week. I'll be back on the 14th, a little bit on national maple market development, some of the projects going on within the member associations, and a little bit of an overview of the different market research that's been popping up in the past couple of years, which is exciting. Then on the 21st, another maple financial planning session. And then Chris Lindgren will present. We'll take a week off on October 5th. He's going to present on SAP business models and looking at assessment of the sugar bush before you start, and then some of the considerations of just running a SAP only business rather than converting SAP completely into a finished syrup product. All right, transfer planning, succession planning. I think first I'll start just to say that the words that I use are, I think, kind of interchangeable. I'll say transfer planning. Coming up in the farm business planning world, for better or worse, there's been an assumption of this idea of transfer within a family and the concept of a family farm. It's a great concept, but I will like interject the word succession. And I think in tonight's presentation, you'll hear there's definitely specific dynamics of the transfer of a family business within family, and there are specific dynamics to a small family business. But we certainly know, both in the farm and maple community, that business transfers do not have to happen within the family. And so the idea of succession, or I may even see exit, sale, buy-sell agreements, really the concept we're getting at tonight is the idea of there being current owners or partners, and there is an intent and an outlook for other owners to come into the business world or come into business ownership in whatever form that may be. So there is some specific reference to family, but this isn't this is not on some assumption that there are younger children that are growing up necessarily. Maybe not. So my experience, I've been doing transfer planning in Vermont for 15 years on and off, mixed in with the business planning I've been doing. We all know the trends. The survey that we did with the Northeast producers, I think our average age was well over 55 or 57 years old for primary owner of a business. And it's never too early to start succession or transfer planning. Unfortunately, it sometimes can be late if you don't start until late in your career, late in your life. A lot of these things are better if they're staged over time, and we'll talk a little bit about that tonight when we start to get into the specifics of some estate planning. Okay, so what is transfer planning, succession planning? Really the multi-year process for current farm owners, family members, and future farm owners, whether they're family or not, to discuss the things that need to be discussed, to analyze the things that need to be analyzed, some serious looks at the business, serious looks at the people, and then to make decisions. The discussion and the analysis can take years, and it can play out. Certain decisions can be made early on, and certain other decisions often can get kind of pushed off for good reasons as the process unfolds. But we're basically talking about the future ownership framework and the future management framework of an existing business. I put some pictures up there. Love the free clip art that I can find. I just want to highlight, that idea of a house of cards. Um, when the situation is shaky at best, the transfer and succession planning can become difficult, or let's just say vulnerable. So I've seen some examples of things that can kind of set up, a house of cards, so to speak, when it comes to business transfer. One of them, I think, just really generally is anyone that has the assumption that the other people in the process are going to think the way that they think or value things the way that they value them, that could be a shaky starting ground. When I've seen parents that assume that the children, let's say, have the same value framework that they have, um, that's an assumption that can sometimes set things off a little bit. Other things that can be shaky, struggling businesses. That's not to say that business ownership it's always going to be perfect and businesses are going to be clear sailing. But when businesses are really struggling, like chronically not profitable or chronically have challenges financially, that can be a shaky situation to try to set up to be transitioned to another owner. So that's just kind of two examples. And I think the real emphasis with the planning process is try to set up that foundation both in the process and to take a hard look at that business or that property and try to start to find those solid frameworks that you can work off of, not only for the planning process but also for the future framework that's actually going to last. We're not trying to do some magical thing when it defies all odds. We really want to have a setup for success, which is long term. The idea of the transition and making maybe a legacy out of that enterprise. So I mentioned transfer. I did mention, exit and sale. The two buckets that I often put this work into is if I sit at kitchen tables with people and start talking about their business. Um, we're looking at the transfer, the exit, the sale, or the acquisition of really the management of business operations and decision making. That may be a starting point and may be separate than what's below it, which is the ownership of farm assets. We really do have two different zones in there. We've got operators, and some of you on the session tonight are the actual operators, right? You've got a certain skill set and you've got authority and you're making decisions to keep the enterprise running. Um, that is something that warrants consideration in transfer, transition, even sales, right? How will that institutional knowledge transfer to the next person? Also, what is the ability for that next person to take over full decision making? That's clearly separate than the ownership of items. And then the pictures below really emphasize that really two classes of items. You've got some short-term items, things like equipment, 10 to 20-year lifespan. They may be a very different framework in the transfer or the buyout or sell plan compared to property ownership. And there's some implications, certainly. Different asset types are going to stack up differently from the perspective of both the exiting owners and what they need for security now and later, and then also what I'll call the acquiring parties, the different needs that they might have sooner or later. So with transfer planning, certainly in the context of a family transfer or a non-family transfer, there is the future of the family that's being discussed, right? There's this concept that there's individuals that have been doing this thing for a while, individuals or teams, and they're possibly sunsetting on their careers. Then there's the future of the business. Is this business sunsetting? Is this business model sunsetting? Businesses can adapt and certainly adapt over time, just like people do. But I'd say with transfer, we know that the exiting owners are clearly sunsetting on the career. And then the question is often with that business model, what's the future of this business? Does it need to be managed or can it be managed in the same format? Or is this business going to look dramatically different over the next 20 years? That'll have a big impact on how the planning discussions go as it relates to those things like decision making and asset ownership. We've got legacies on the line here, especially if we've got family decisions to be making. There's land, there's wealth, equity hopefully built up in property. There's the vocation, the occupation of farming, and then this concept of family harmony or conflict is a big part of this from a family perspective, and that's both within if there's exiting owners that are say parents and acquiring owners that are children, could be nieces and nephews. I've seen that for sure. Also, the potential for conflict if you've got two owner partners, whether they're spouses or brothers or stepbrothers, cousins. The family dynamic, they're bound to this concept of property or family legacy. We get into some pretty strong emotional territory there, and it's got to be factored into the planning and factored into how decisions get made. And we've certainly got this opportunity for the new owners and this vision, the sun's rising on that next business model and those next individuals, and it could be very different. So we're kind of trying to manage all those things going on with with the knowledge that we've got different people in different places. And that dynamic of people coming and going, it really came to bear. I've been a part of the Vermont Farm Viability Program for over a decade, and we've been doing transfer planning with individuals. Just give you a snapshot of what those programs have done here in Vermont. They're one-on-one planning programs, and let me say one-on-one is probably a bad acronym because it's usually 1-on-5 with a transfer plan. You've got an advisor, and you could have exiting owners or future exiting owners, then you could have possibly acquiring parties or family members in those discussions. Transfer plans do not develop quickly and get finished quickly. For us, from a technical assistance standpoint, we could be working for 12 to 18 months with a particular owner or family. The planning process never really seems to be done because it's like kind of incremental. There might be some decisions that get made early on, but often these things play off or play out over, could be 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Ideally, owners are starting to have these conversations in their 50s, and the quote transfer may stage over time, and certain aspects, especially like a real estate transition, those things may not occur until death. So you could have a staged transfer, and the actual quote transfer of the property or the farm, it may not happen 15, 20 years out. This idea of people coming and going really became important within our program, because what we found was if we sometimes tried to have this kumbaya moment, and as an advisor, as me to come to a kitchen table and sit with, say, mom and dad and daughter, and then maybe a son that lives in DC that's got a great federal government career that doesn't farm, to facilitate that conversation, pretty exciting, pretty dynamic. But what we found was sometimes you need different advisors for different parties, and the parents often needed a split advisor to specifically talk about exiting the business, retirement, estate planning. And then say that daughter, as an example, actually needed an advisor to talk about the specifics of coming into the business, what was needed on her part to come in. So I'm going to really hit on that a little bit tonight, this idea of exiting owners and what I'll call these acquiring parties or prospective owners, and really recognition that they need different things. And this is really going to be the building blocks. We will talk a little bit about some legal dynamics, but really general tonight, really to kind of set the stage for the process, knowing that there's going to be a lot of technical things that come up, and I'll be glad to share resources with people if you're moving into those next steps. Basic elements in a maple business transfer. Like I said, these things may not happen first, but let's look at the hard assets. Someone owns the forest property. Somebody owns and is invested in buildings. Someone's made improvements. Those improvements, we know, 15, 20, 30-year lifespan. Have you built roads in the woods? Have you established culvert systems? Following forestry practices, and you've maybe done some things to set up that's going to have a lasting impact on that property. A home on the property or houses on the property. I'll even add potential house sites on the property. Those can be key bargaining chips in estate planning as you start to think about what you pass on to individuals within the family, and they have significant values. You start to add up, the value of goods. Equipment, if you're in the sugaring business, we know there's a lot of equipment there. A lot of shiny stainless steel. So the other bucket, the management responsibilities, right? We've got to figure out the transition of making decisions and who gets to make decisions when. Debts and obligations, investments, prior investments in the business, debts out in banks or other capital providers. Capital access, especially for that younger generation or newer owners. How are they going to access the capital to run the business? And compensation, for sure. If these are business models that we think are viable employment opportunities for people, then we start to look at compensation / profitability to understand the outlook for those new owners, what they're getting into. Looking at family transfer here a little more specifically. And even if the business is going to be shifted to a non-family member, I'm going to assume there's owners that have a family dynamic potentially to be sorted out, especially when we're talking about land equity and any long-term wealth you've generated. So here are the things that come up when I'm visiting with family on transfer things. Parents need to decide about their estate plan and inheritance. They need to be thinking about the progression of them sunsetting in their lives and whatever they've built up or whatever opportunities they want to impart on children or other family members or within the broader community, charitable giving, things like that all get factored in. And they need to be thought about and need to be thought hard about. Farming and non-farming children, a key factor in a family situation for sure. Is there a member of the family that's already been involved in the business? And what have they been putting in, potentially uncompensated? What have they been putting into the business? And do you have other family members that are not active in the business, but they may be getting some form of share of inheritance, or that would be the intention? So navigating that. You'll see fair versus equal come up a lot in the literature if you start reading any worksheets, if you check out any of the links that we pop up here. This is a real important concept, and really let's see, the best example for this is fair. Fair is not always equal. And the classic example could be the story, let's go with a stereotypical story of a family dairy farm and a daughter that stays on the farm and works and is undercompensated for 15 years. And the parents are still involved into their 70s because it's the love of their life. And then you come to the transfer plan and you try to figure out, now, how in fact is this daughter going to buy out the other brothers that potentially want an equal share of $1 million property? And you start to look at the numbers and you say, oh, well, this person put a lot of sweat equity in and wasn't compensated. So can we just split the property into $3 dollar amounts and deal with buyouts? And it's like, well, no, the fair is not equal. So you start to factor in some of those things. And I mean, there's guidance. I don't know that there's a rule book on this, but just the concept that the dollar values don't necessarily match up to what we would consider fair when you start to think about the dynamics of agriculture, the dynamics of sugaring here. Different opinions. We're going to have different opinions in family. I don't think anyone's surprised by that. And then the big thing often happens is the current owners being able to let go. This is a big issue, often a big problem in certain projects I see that don't tend to move forward. The concept of everyone liking the idea of transfer, but when it gets down to it, certain people, potentially founders of a business, having a very difficult time letting other people make management decisions, getting out of the way for that next generation of ownership to come into management. And those are big factors, and you can imagine we're starting to kind of push on family dynamics through a lot of this. That idea of letting go is often a little cleaner in non-family buyouts for sure, but it needs to be addressed for sure. All right, so why do people avoid transfer, succession, exit planning? No one likes the word exit planning. I think they don't want to admit that they're getting out or giving up. Here's what I've seen: people that really avoid this to potentially to the problem level where it gets too late. I don't have time. We're always busy. Yeah, life's busy, right? This is really busy. The business is struggling. When the business is struggling, it's certainly difficult to sort of get out of it and start doing long-term planning. Often when the business is struggling, that can put up so many hurdles to transfer or succession planning that the members often don't really fully engage, or they sort of maybe know what the outcome will be. This is when the younger generation clearly doesn't show interest because they know there's maybe no future compensation or livelihood from that particular property. This is often maybe where existing owners have a real difficult time even engaging in transfer, succession, or sale, because it's painful to be a part of a business that's been struggling for years, or maybe has been profitable and viable for a couple decades, but then having a bad trend. People get embarrassed. People feel vulnerable talking about struggling businesses. Other reasons to avoid transfer planning. It's difficult to talk about death. Yes. Um, Family tension, competing interests. Yes. The fair versus equal dilemma. I mentioned that. Won't get into it too much. Um, it's just difficult stuff, especially for people if you're in the forestry world and you've sort of thrived on being active and resilient and able to tolerate climbing up and down steep slopes with or without snowshoes. This idea of aging is difficult for sure. And then having those discussions with not just family members, but outside advisors and bankers can take it to the next level. All right, estate planning. So I'm going to use the estate planning in real general term. I'm an extension guy, right? So I got enough knowledge to hopefully not be dangerous, but maybe to be informative. I'm not an estate attorney. I'm not an estate tax planner, but I've certainly been at that kitchen table or been on the phone with people that are in this process. So in my role, this is the things that I think are important. And if you talk to a tax or a legal professional, they're going to give you a much more specific list. So this is the entry level for me in a technical assistance role. When I come to the table with people that saying we got to start working on this concept of succession or transfer or sale. What's important for the current owners? Well, first of all, you got to develop your vision and your goals for the future. If your husband and wife team, your partner, your brothers, you got to talk together and you got to figure out what it is that's important, because those are the things that are going to start to set this process in motion, and they're going to be sort of the guide rails, so to speak, on what you want to see happen, or possibly draw some lines in the sand of things you can't see happen, or maybe when you've crossed like a time frame. Next, determining your future needs: income, housing, basic needs. This gets mostly into personal living, but the assumption that if you're living on a house that's on a property with an active business, that's getting into interesting situation. What's going to happen for the future owners? Will you still live in that property? Are they going to want to live in that home? In either situation, it has to be accounted for the acquiring party to have enough money to live someplace potentially, or for the exiting party to have a future residence or the means to live where they need to live. So you're thinking about your retirement budget, and you're thinking about some of those things like medical planning that you weren't thinking about in your younger years, so you can really understand as an owner what you need to get out. You're going to organize the information, right? Resources and assets, try to figure out what you own, titles, get those things in order for property, debts, obligations. I don't generally do, I don't see people do professional paid appraisals right off the bat. Often in my role as an extension business person, we can do evaluation on business property from a management perspective. That's not something that's going to get stamped by a licensed or certified appraiser, but it's good enough to get people started. We get you in the right ballpark. Do you got $500,000 worth of stuff that's paid for? Do you have $750,000? Do you have $1 million worth of stuff? You at a level where you may start to push on thresholds for federal tax exemptions wherever they are at certain points in history. So we can do some of that, and you can certainly do some of that on your own before a professional gets involved. And then another basic thing that's important for current owners, obviously, is getting input from the family members. If we're dealing with a business family dynamic here, we got to start talking about both family stuff, family property, and business property. And if we're talking about just business, we still are getting input from family members, certainly on if there's other people that had an expectation of being involved in the future business. But let's be clear, like right off the bat, do they have an interest or a need or a want or an expectation to be involved in the decisions? At least giving their input so that the current owners can make decisions. So a real basic starting point, right? Get your needs in order, get some of your records in order, get your resource assessments in order, and get your family in order if there's more people involved. Family communication, right? Taking it to the next level, getting everyone's input or attempting to get everyone's input. I've worked with families where the senior owner didn't necessarily get along very well with one of his children. And it became clear that the transfer planning really couldn't go forward without sharing information back to the children. And this individual actually cut videos, we cut these 40, 50-minute videos where the owner just basically talked about what was important to him, his wife, and the future of the business. And it wasn't even an invitation to say, hey, daughter, I want your input. It was just, we haven't talked in years and I need you to know where I'm at and what's important to me because I'm going to be making some pretty serious decisions. So you got this idea of getting people's input, sharing information, and figuring out, honestly, are you asking for people's input or do you just need to share what you have to say? One of the things that can be really difficult for the exiting owners, the parents often, is there are difficult decisions to make. And granted, if you've had children and if you've kind of worked your best to support kids, sometimes people are waiting for the feedback from the children to guide the process. And I've often seen that as a real sticking point when the current owners haven't really owned their responsibility to make decisions to move it forward. So difficult decisions to make, communication needs to continue. The next generation can often find it pretty difficult to wait. If this process doesn't show action, like I said, it could take years, but even the idea of having progress where people can communicate, it can drive the younger generation nuts. It can also drive new parties nuts if they're thinking this is not going anywhere. So I think that's important just to keep in mind that hold on one second, I'm just going to do a little clicking here. Okay. It can be difficult to be stuck with difficult decisions, not be necessarily making progress, or maybe, but knowing that other people could be frustrated by that. Productive family meetings, no different than business meetings with employees. How do you set up the framework? How do you move this thing forward? Okay, values. What's important and why? I'm going to go through a couple examples of things I've seen and how people have had different perspectives on that. At the end of the session, I'll put some links in the chat and people can email me. We've got a couple worksheets, and often in my early meetings, I'm either giving people worksheets if I don't think I'll be back again, or we're just having these conversations and I'm asking questions like this. What's important to you about the farm today in general? Some people will get right into the business and how it's important to have a great business. Other people will say things like, well, it's really important for me to look out my back window and not see a parking lot, right? If you've got forested land or meadows, whatever it is, you're going to get so many different opinions from people. And I encourage you to start really big like that. Like, what is important about this maple operation for you today? What are the hopes over the next 10 years? I've had a lot of elder farm owners come to me and say, uh, they've got a certain date in mind. I intend to not be involved in the farm by the time I'm 75 or 70, and they've got some kind of clear time frames going on. So thinking about where you're at in that time frame, being 45 or 50 and setting up buy-sell agreements is different than being 70 and kind of thinking where you'll be in 5 years. What are the things you want other family members to know? Back to those things I said before, right? There are things to be said, and there's also time for listening if you've got to facilitate this kind of ongoing family process. And believe it or not, you're talking about a business legacy, but you're certainly leaving a family legacy, especially when you start moving around property ownership. Like it or not, there's going to be people that they're going to have to live beyond you, and you want to be thoughtful, I think, about what you leave for them, both materially, but also that dynamic of you know not everyone getting what they want, but the dynamic of people sort of understanding where other people are coming from. So let's look at a few more of these values, right? I know people where the idea of a paid job for that maple business, that's an important thing, right? And that's a real important factor in the whole decision making. And then for others, maple may be a little bit of a sideline, maybe more of a lifestyle or a hobby based on the scale of the business. So we've got kind of two opposites there: paid job, lifestyle, hobby. Very important to get that cleared up early on in the process. That could set a certain trajectory for the succession or potentially sale or exit. Okay, land ownership can be critical for collateral for borrowing, can be critical for long-term security for people thinking that they're going to be there on the property forever. For others, it's just access to land. It may be rental agreements, maybe long-term lease. So two different distinctions there. Land ownership has a certain factor or certain value in this, and then we've got just access in general for people that potentially want to operate but don't necessarily feel like they need to or maybe can't own the property outright. We got decision-making control. People love to have decision-making control. And then there's this concept of teamwork, partnerships, multi-member entities. And let's understand that dynamic as well and understand where you think you can play into either one of those. And then I mentioned before, business and family, right? Two different things often interwoven there, either with intergenerational items or just the idea of a single business owner that's got a spouse or partner involved in either the estate planning or involved in the idea of long-term family planning, inheritance, things like that, wills and testaments. All right, so what could go wrong, right? I don't know how many of you have sat through other business presentations where we talk about the 5Ds: death, disability, disaster, divorce. Disagreements is like the softest one of those, right? I think the first four are the ones that can be difficult emotionally for people. Often, in most cases, a lot of these can be difficult to plan. They can come up unexpectedly, and they can have massive impacts on ownership, on relationships, and let's face it, they can have drastic impacts on ownership. So as you're going about transfer planning, as you're going about legal planning in general for a business, these are the 5Ds, right? Be aware of them and then ask yourself, how likely is this risk? How likely is it that this risk can occur to me? How significant could it be if it were to occur to me? Are we protected? And this planning process, transfer planning, is the recognition that, well, the big one at the top, the death, like death could happen, disability could happen as people age. Is this business positioned to be available to somebody else? And the recognition that if you're the owner, we want your input now when you're thinking clearly, if it's going to be about the direction of where this is going. All right, and then we've kind of thought about what's going on with the likelihood of this risk, and then what are the steps needed to manage this. And talk a little bit about some of the legal frameworks that certainly people hear about and are relevant for transfer planning, but across the board, right? Legal agreements, insurance, again, just family communication, people knowing what the expectation is, knowing what the intent is, can often be very important. All right, that's a little bit on the exiting owners. And now we're going to look at the future owners, acquiring parties. What is it that they need out of this planning process? They often want to know the business situation now. They really want some clarity on records, profitability, financials. What is this thing that they're considering? Workload, I think, is another real big factor, especially intergenerationally here. We've got people in different ages that have a different mindset on how much work is appropriate. Also, if you've got people with different family statuses, they have different ability to put in hours, right? So I don't say younger generation all the time, let's call it the acquiring parties. What's the business situation now? What are the business inventories? What is this business? How much equipment is there? How much did this equipment cost? If we're talking about buying in, what is the value of these things? Market outlook, a huge factor. Earlier, I said that the business model in 10 years is not necessarily the business model of today. So that market outlook and the feasibility plan for this business is very important for that next generation that's going to be stepping into ownership. And then property ownership outlook really can't be ignored. This is where the rubber hits the road often, where people are saying, I want to buy property, or I need to have collateral, I'm thinking about making improvements in this property. Nobody wants to make 20-year improvements on a property that they don't think they're going to own. Those are some of the factors that can go into this. From the younger generation, the acquiring party saying, I'm interested in this. And these are the things that we got to talk about for me to know if I can step forward in negotiation or structuring some sort of deal. Future farmers got to have a plan, right? So do they have the skills? Can they manage? Can they step in and manage this 10,000 tap operation? Can they step in? Do they know how to manage websites, online maple sales, all those dynamics? So you've got skills, potentially a training plan. I always ask the younger generation, what's their professional development plan? Like, how do they expect to acquire enough information to move into the business and move the business to where it maybe needs to be again in 10 years? Readiness to take ownership, both from a work perspective, but capital access. Do they have the money that it's going to take if there's going to need to be a buy-in, or even just to maintain the property? And then if they're coming from situations where they've had wages, are they prepared to move into ownership of a called owner-operated business where they may not be getting a paycheck? It's a different format, how you recoup or draw value, draw profits out of a business. So those are really important factors, especially for that younger owner or that entering owner. Okay, so big picture, talked about being an owner, talked about what that next acquiring owner may be interested in, and transfer planning certainly wouldn't be possible without other advisors. So who are they? Facilitators like myself. Might have someone who's clearly a third party, knows something about your family, knows something in my case about Maple and farm finances, someone that can convene the meeting, someone that can establish some homework or manage some information back and forth. That certainly there's a value in that. In some cases, mediator, counselors are needed. You need other advisors, especially when it gets into heated communication between family members. Potentially conflict may come up. This is not uncommon, right? Not uncommon, especially beautiful mountainside property here with a couple family members that are not into maple sugaring. Believe me, the opportunity for a mediator to help kind of smooth out expectations for what happens to the future value of that property is a real deal. Legal professionals. In a second, I'll give a little bit overview on legal, but clearly we're talking about business entity formations. So you're either sole proprietor or LLCs, S Corps, C Corps. Those are the business entities. Then we move into the instruments of moving money, moving value, moving ownership. Lawyers certainly involved in operating agreements and transfers that include those. So we got legal professionals, and then last year tax professionals. Super important. It's super important for taxation, and I'm also going to throw in elder care, elder care financial planners. Certainly, I know it's there. I've been to meetings, enough of them, and I can't remember the specifics, but the idea of understanding the dynamics of money, taxes, legal agreements when it comes to estate planning is going to be essential. It's essential for the exiting owner, and it's also essential for the acquiring party. If you've got an ownership of a business and you've been in denial of federal taxes, or you've been strategically pushing off on capital gains, the future acquiring party is going to be implicated in the outcomes of that potentially, right? So we've got to be able to connect those dots. It's not just about trying to pay the lowest amount of taxes for the exiting owners. The younger generation here needs a viable starting point too, right? So we've got to gonna have to balance some of those trade-offs between those different parties, and then professionals are going to be. I've found them always necessary in not just planning, but certainly implementation when the decisions have been made, and it's time to actually enact certain agreements. We need those specialists, and they can be a big part of it. Doesn't mean they need to be there, day in and day out, but know that they're going to be valuable to the process. All this stuff is about planning, right? Thinking about values, getting assessments, inventories, values, getting people together to talk. So we're talking about all these things to plan. theoretically, right, you want to have some outcomes. You want to develop and execute formal agreements. But I just want to make it clear that you may be ready to go right off the bat. It may take a period of time, depending on your ownership and depending who that other party is coming in, to be ready to actually make decisions and then enact them. So this is going to be a really quick overview because I'm not the attorney here, but some of those core documents or tools to execute, right? Wills need to be in place at the baseline. Then we start talking about trust planning, just a couple examples: revocable trusts, living, irrevocable trusts, joint tenancy upon survivorship. You know, there's different legal instruments related to transfer of ownership and understanding when that happens. Gifting, mentioned the attorneys or the tax preparers earlier. If there's going to be incremental gifting over 10 or 15 years or 5 years, working with tax professionals on that. Business entities, we could talk about a little bit if people have questions, but different structures and different business entities to bring in different members. Certainly tools here, buy-sell agreements. These are just a couple really quick tools to understand that they're out there. And what I want to close by saying is that when you start the transfer planning process, I don't think anyone should be tool oriented. You shouldn't be asking yourself, what legal tool am I going to use? Is it an LLC? Is it a trust? Really what you want to be able to do is start those goals and then hand those things to the professional. Say, these are our goals. These are our kind of criteria. What's the instrument? And then the professional guidance can often say, yeah, hey, trust may be a good option here. Or they could say, no, that's not the way we're gonna do this. This is just a single session, hour session. We do have a short course that I'll be teaching that starts at the end of September. That's going to be 4 sessions, an hour and a half each week. That's going to basically take this introduction and move it to the next level into those different planning steps. So I want people to be aware of that. And there's a couple prompts while I read some questions. So Nick says, is there a marketplace for available land, operations, or equipment? Let me read all of these. Is there a marketplace for available land, operations, or equipment? Best practices, top pitfalls, and tips for the acquirer. That's a good one. Is it best practice for the acquirer to get a broker or an advisor? Is there a marketplace for available land? I don't know if you're actually saying is there an actual platform, and certainly there's real estate listings. I don't know that there's anything specific for Maple sales. I certainly see, like, gosh, is it Landvest or something? They have like the huge properties. Other people, please feel free to chat in some answers here. So what I would say though, Nick, is aside from the technical platforms, knowing that the ownership profile of sugar makers in Vermont is probably well over 55, there is land, operations, and equipment that I'd say is more and more likely to become available or to be, suggested for sale or transfer. So just the demographics alone lead us to believe that there's just a lot of these kind of pending situations coming up for owners as they get older. Best practices, pitfalls, tips for the acquirer. Well, let's see. For Maple, I'd say it's always valuable to get experience in multiple places. One of the best things for a family farm transfer is for children that have left the farm for a period of time, right? They've left the farm, they've developed skills elsewhere, they've been trained or mentored by other managers other than parents, and they've actually intentionally come back. So that's like a little bit of the family thing, I would say, is get away from that place for a while and then come back for all the right reasons, not stay there because that's what you know. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it's often very successful when people come back for specific reasons and they come back with new skills. I think pitfalls for the acquirer, I don't know. Honestly, I've actually seen a lot more honesty from people looking to acquire properties, in the sense of, like, they kind of put the existing owners not on the defensive, but they're pretty clear in saying, well, I need to know what you need. I need to know if I need to buy this. I need to know the status of the business. So often the acquiring party is asking really the right questions. And sometimes it's the exiting owners that are kind of stuck because they've owned and operated it for 20 years and they've never really had to answer those questions before to somebody else. It's never been necessary. So I think it's just key for the acquiring party to be honest and ask questions. Yeah, and I'm not too familiar with parties using brokers or third parties. Certainly advisors, like I said, like we've definitely dealt with people that are farm seekers in our programs. Maybe they've had management jobs on other maple or farm operations, and it's clear they're looking. And we've been involved with them because maybe they're already in our network and they're working on feasibility plans for maybe like a land trust property, things like that. So it definitely doesn't hurt to have an advisor, in the general sense. From a broker perspective, I don't have tons of experience on that.
All makes sense.
There we
Thanks for
go.
the answers. One follow-up there. For the land piece, yeah. So for the land piece, it makes sense to use the existing ones. But I am more interested in how, as a potential acquirer, one would find the opportunities that of people willing and interested in selling. So, do you act as a information source for that?
Yeah, I certainly I see a lot of stuff come as an extension person. We see a lot of stuff come across our desk. What I don't do is I try not to get in that kind of role of kind of being a broker, especially with like private property transfers. But yeah, having a network, let's start off that having a network, right? We do hear of things for sure, or we know like Dave says, yeah, well, like the Maple News, right? There's a publication where things are going to be, published and classified. So having those connections. And then the other thing about the network, I would say, from my experience in the Maple community, it is a relatively small community. And then and there's opportunities within the producer associations. There are member associations. In Vermont, let's say, even for me, I've been involved with the state association and I've gone to a couple county meetings. Some of you, if you're producers, you probably have more relationship at the county level. Getting involved in those networks and those associations, even if you're not currently sugaring, I think is probably potentially the best way to have that kind of inside scoop. Participating with those groups of people, and especially I'd say in the maple community, you may be working for a sugar maker, you may volunteer, but gosh, it's fair season right now, and I've got a whole bunch of volunteer requests to to spin cotton candy or to do maple samples at upcoming fairs. So I'd say getting involved in the community is like probably one of those anchor ways to just know what's happening.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, great question. Okay, keep them coming in the chat, or okay, Dave's got one. Could you comment on the advantages or disadvantages of leasing a sugar house and sugar bush rather than transferring them to the next owner? Okay, I'll give some ideas and chime in here if something more specific comes up. I know of maple owners that have family members that potentially could be getting groomed to take over the business and the property. The generally existing owners, and this gets into estate planning, that real estate is like so valuable. And this depends again on the dynamics of your estate planning. Often that ownership of property is something that can often wait till the end or needs to wait till the end for certain reasons. And this may be coming into the estate planning inheritance of how the property is intended to transfer. So in a lot of cases, the exiting owners don't, or maybe not, is not advisable to give up ownership. And there's a situation where they may need to set up a lease. Two reasons why you may need to set up a lease. Let me just start with the sugar house or sugar bush. If you've got a party there, family or not, that's interested, and you're unable to transfer ownership to them immediately, they're going to need some sort of security, right? This is the idea of that younger generation or that acquiring party getting kind of antsy and feeling like, how can I invest my passion and my time into this thing unless I have some security? So a 10 or 20-year lease could potentially be the mechanism to show it to them, hey, we're serious about this, and it's formalized, right? And that's the key. It's not a handshake agreement, it's formalized. We have heard stories, and I'm sure some of you have, about handshake agreements or assumptions of access to property. Someone dies or is disabled, and other family members take control of the estate, and the people that thought they were going to be having long-term access to the property, the sugar house, don't anymore. And that is the unfortunate reality um, of family members that maybe have disagreements, but it's also the unfortunate reality of informal agreements or non-formal agreements. So there's one reason, right? So owners they can't sell, so they've got to set up a lease. Acquiring party needs some sort of security, and so it's in everyone's best interest to set up something formal. Another example I've had, again, family members where the parents are saying, okay, I think this person could be potentially an owner. I don't really want them to think that we're going to give this place to them. So this is, again, in sort of this weird incentive negotiation, like preparatory process of saying, well, let's draw some lines here and let's see if we can have this other party start to rent the property, rent the taps, or rent the sugar house. And it serves a couple functions. A, it starts to put the business pressure on that acquiring party to run a business that can actually afford these things, right? If they can afford lease payments on a regular basis, if there potentially needs to be a buyout, let's assume that they can have a business now that's positioned to pay debt service if they actually have to mortgage a portion. Not every family can just, give the property away. And certainly if some of you don't have family members, you're expecting to sell, right? You've been building value. And the idea is I've built some value here. I'd like to cash in on that value. And somebody else would love to step into an enterprise that's been established, and they may pay $50,000, $100,000, for the ongoing interest of the business, let alone the real estate that it stands on. So I'm just kind of shooting from the hip with a couple examples I've seen. One other popped to mind: incentivizing, setting up the business for success. Oh, and then let's face it, if there's different entities involved, Dave, if in the process of planning, there's been a decision to hold the real estate in the ownership of the current owners and perhaps form an LLC that the current owners and the acquiring party have shared ownership of. So let me give you an example of a mom, a dad, and let's have a mom and dad and a non-related family member that's been working with this business for a while. And the decision maybe is made that the mom and dad are going to split off the real estate into one LLC or other sort of entity. And they want to bring in that employee as a partial owner. And so they establish a separate LLC that's 33% dad, 33% mom, 33% new entrant. And here's a situation where this LLC now is going to have to interact with the landowners, and there's another mechanism or an opportunity for there to be split entities, and then leasing just becomes this transactional formal process between multiple entities. So I'm just hitting you with a couple things I've observed, and it's, really case by case, but they're tools. These are different tools. I could take another question, but it's definitely fine for us to wrap up here. I told you about the short course. Oh, here's one other thing I want to put in the chat before people go. UVM, Zach Smith, one of my coworkers, he actually is doing some transfer planning, like resource assistance. And so I'm going to put this link in the chat box. If you're interested in the short course, that's great. That's starting in a month, but here's another cool option. Zach is basically just helping source resources for people. So if you're interested in succession planning, you can put an inquiry in through this form for Zach, and he may actually be able to pull some literature for you that's a little targeted. And then I got one other thing I want to share. We've got some worksheets of our own for exiting owners and entering owners that are great ways to prep for the process. And you can find a lot of these online. If you look up, I don't know if there's much on maple transition, to be honest, but if you look up agricultural or forestry succession planning, that'd be my keyword search. Extension, which is great because that's public information. Extension, forestry, succession planning worksheets, and you can find a number of these kind of question and answer sheets. But this is really with the starting point that I use if I'm on site with the owner working through it.